Thank you for joining us tonight as we have a discussion on racism, how it affects people in our community. We also have a group of allies who want to be a positive part of a change as we move forward. Our monitor tonight is going to be Dr. Shelley Zion from the Rowan Center for Access and Equity. And with that, I'm going to turn the program over to Dr. Zion, and she'll go over the ground rules and introduce our panels.
Good evening, everyone. You should be able to, if you're unfamiliar with Zoom, in your upper right-hand corner, see an icon that gives you the choice to check speaker view that maybe you want to see. There are also chat boxes that at the bottom of your screen, which is where you will want to, somebody's got their mic on that shouldn't. Okay. At the bottom is a chat room, and that's where you can post questions. So I am going to start with a brief overview and then move us to our panel. The thing that I want to say to set some context is this. It is that there is nothing new here in this conversation that we're about to have tonight. This is not about one incident that has happened, either historically or currently. It is, however, on the forefront of our minds because of the intersection of a series of events that started 400 years ago and is now occurring and brought to our attention by the disparate impacts that the African American community has faced in light of COVID, economic impacts, health impacts, mortality impacts. It is also evident in the killing of Breonna Taylor in her bed, of Ahmaud Arbery when he was hunted down by white men while jogging, George Floyd, who was murdered by the police, Amy Cooper, who weaponized race in Central Park, and Tony McDade, who was shot by the police while in crisis. All of these things have come together to point out to Black people that we are not safe anywhere, and to highlight for white people, particularly those who choose to be allies, that now is in fact the time to take action. So it's not about one thing, it's about the accumulation of things. It is the accumulation of a system of anti-Blackness and white supremacy. And I want to focus our attention on that idea of the system, that this is about the system. It is not about individuals. It is not about individual misbehaviors or misdeeds. It's not about being responsible for the actions of our ancestors. It is about taking responsibility for repairing the systems that we still benefit from, that are grounded in anti-Blackness and white supremacy. It is about creating brave spaces where we continue to examine our own privilege, our own complicity. It's about committing to uncomfortable conversations, to critical self-reflection, and to the ongoing work of dismantling systems. It's about disrupting the culture of politeness and about being uncomfortable. It's about avoiding defensiveness and fragility. It's not about focusing on intent, but it's instead focusing on impact and action. It's about a commitment to becoming active in our anti-racist work. With that in mind, the structure of our conversation tonight is two panels. The first panel is a group of people that includes current students, recent alum, educators, and community members who have been impacted by racism during their time in Haddonfield Public Schools. Each of those panelists will spend a few minutes providing some story of their experience, and then we will take questions. After that first 45 minutes, we will shift to a second panel, which is made up similarly of current student, recent alum, educators, and community members who have taken up the work of being actively anti-racist. They will also present for a minute. We will take questions there. The important thing with the questions are threefold. One is we had invited questions in advance. We have those, we have looked at those, we have a sense of what they are. We also want you to be posing questions in the chat, particularly in response to the conversations raised by the people on the panels. And if you feel a urgent need to be able to speak your comment, rather than just have it compiled as part of the list of running comments, you'll be able to put that in the chat as well. Be like, hey, Fred here, and I'd like to speak about, but we do want you to mention what you're going to speak about. We have a very short period of time, really, for questions. And so we want to be able to make sure that we're capturing all of them. Our focus is on questions that the panelists can ask. The panelists are not the decision makers at the district. There were many questions posed in the early opening questions that are specifically for district leadership. They have committed to answering those questions and responding by posting them either on the website or via some other forum. So any questions that are really specific for the district administration or Board of Ed will be answered, but not in this particular space. With that said, I want to shift to our panel. I'm going to ask each panelist to introduce themselves when they start, and their introduction will include their name and their connection to Haddonfield, their role with the school, how long they've been there, something to set some context for us. Then they will each share their own stories for up to 5 minutes. I want to start, I think, with Makai. Is Makai? There you go.
Okay, so hello, my name is Makai. I am a rising senior at Haddonfield Memorial High School. So, and I'm also involved with a lot of different leadership at the high school. So my senior year, I'm going to be school-wide student council president of Haddonfield Memorial High School. And then I'm also president of Peer Bias Leaders at the high school, which is sort of team building / working with the school district itself and working with the school community to bring awareness to different demographics of people and the idea of diversity. And that was started my sophomore year in response to the lacrosse incident that happened my freshman year. So are you hear me? Okay. I moved to the high school freshman year, and moving from Pennsauken, which was a lot more, had a lot more diversity and had a lot more diversity in their students, and then moving to Haddonfield, which was kind of the opposite of that. That was difficult. And then to kind of have to deal with the lacrosse incident and how that shook the Haddonfield culture was really difficult, when I felt like I was kind of alone and people really didn't want to associate with someone that stood by the stance that the lacrosse team deserved what they received. So that was a really difficult moment in my life, and having to navigate that kind of built up a lot of tough skin for me. And then for me, also in the town, has just kind of been realizing a lack of awareness to a lot of the current issues that are ravaging the country, really. I think the idea of how segregated our schools are really has an effect on how our generation grows up, and how there's so many students that aren't interacting with a Black person of any kind other than the media until maybe they reach college. And there's a good chance that you can go to a college and still not interact with people of color, which is a major issue. So I think that was the big thing that opened my eyes to more of the microaggressions and just in general ignorance on Black culture and on Black issues. So I would say it's definitely been a challenging perspective. I'm thankful that the school has given me a platform to speak on these types of things. Even throughout sophomore year, the support of the Students for Change protest that was this past Wednesday, that I helped arrange with a lot of different students from neighboring towns. So I definitely think I've had a unique experience at Haddonfield. And I do want, and my really big goal is to make sure that for the next Black student that comes to high school, that they have a smoother experience than I do.
Thank you. Now I want to go to Jada.
Hi, am I just introducing myself, or am I telling my story? I just wanted to make sure I'm doing the right thing.
You're doing both things. You're going to introduce yourself and your role, relationship to Haddonfield, and then a story.
Okay, sounds good. I'm Jada Eibel-Hargrove. I'm a rising junior at HMHS. I've been here since first grade, so pretty much before I can kind of remember. I'm vice president of the student council with Makai and also Katrina. I'm also a peer bias leader. So that's just my little background. I'll tell you my stories. It starts in sixth grade. It's an experience that I had. So I wrote it out because I'm not the greatest at words in the moment. Almost every day in middle school, I would hide my curls in the tight bond of a bun on top of my head. After growing tired and frustrated with the monotony of the same hairstyle every day, I decided to wear my hair down. I continued my day just as anybody would until I heard someone say, "What's up with your hair?" I stared blankly at him, wondering to myself, well, what's wrong with it? I had only worn my hair just as all the other girls had. All the other girls wore their hair down every single day. They could change their hairstyle whenever they chose. I had never seen hair like mine before. I had never been exposed to those who looked like me. Before I could even think, another boy said to me, the shelter called, they want their dog back. In the moment, I couldn't even think. I could not even begin to process the strength and the impact of his words. At that time, I could not begin to unpack the magnitude of what he said or even uncover the fact that this was a racially charged comment. To compare an aspect of myself, one that I've struggled and to continue to struggle with to this day, to one of an animal, I am still left in disbelief. This experience is one I revisit periodically when I am always searching for some kind of reason or explanation for his words. It seems to be a perpetual battle in my mind where I want to believe he did not know any better, that those words were his innocence talking. But it wasn't, and it never was. It was his blatant racism talking, his prejudice against those who did not look the same as him, his ignorance of the experiences of those whose skin color differs from that of his own. My heart wants to ignore this reality, but my mind knows better. The reality hurts, but so does the truth. And this really is the ugly reality of living in Haddonfield while Black or African American. So I just wanted to take this opportunity of sharing my story with you to point out the prevalence of the ignorance in our town. Although I do acknowledge how different towns have different needs in their work against racism, I feel as though in Haddonfield, a lot of the racism is built on our community's lack of understanding to the core of the problem. The white population in this school, and not only the Haddonfield residential community, but also in the Haddonfield faculty at all the schools, is so overwhelmingly prominent that there will never be a time a white person feels as though they are alone on a racial basis. Every day they see people who look like them, people whose experiences as a white person rarely differ from one another. I will never understand that. It is important for those who don't live the experiences of a Black person to instead learn and value them. It is not an excuse for someone to say, I'm not racist, I have a Black friend. Exposure is just one step of the way towards combating racism. It is the ability to form relationships with those who differ from you in your life. If the white community of Haddonfield was given the opportunity to form these relationships, then that will allow for learning and thus the capacity for change. So I hope we can change this problem at its root, and we must change the future of our own Haddonfield community, and I hope to work towards that with everyone else.
I want to go to Maddie now.
Hi. Thank you for having me. Thank you, Dr. Zion, for organizing this meeting and all the work that you're doing. My name is Madeline Main. I was a tuition student from 5th grade and graduated in 2012. My brother also graduated from the high school in 2008. And all that time, my mother worked in the Haddonfield School District. Since graduating, Haddonfield has really set me apart in many facets of my life, and I am super grateful for that. But that being said, I want to share my experience being half Black, half white in Haddonfield. And the truth is that it's only now that I'm realizing the harm that covert racism in the form of microaggressions has caused and has impacted my identity. Being biracial, I was never fully myself. I was Black when I needed to be and white when I needed to be, and all the rest of the time I was neutral. And it was exhausting to manage myself for people's expectations because I knew how people felt about Black people, because I listened to and I forgave countless comments made about Black people and other minorities in my presence. Because when you're neutral, people are comfortable to share in front of you, and especially since I was light passing and still am. And during this time, I forgave those comments and statements because I myself was ignorant. They always felt off, these comments, these statements, but there was no language at the time to express that off feeling. And my understanding of racism then was that it was using the N-word. It was more obvious expressions of hate towards a minority. So I forgave the jokes and I forgave the production of The Wiz. That was my musical my senior year. And for those of you who don't know, that musical is created by and for Black people. A predominantly white school should have never put on a production that represents Black pride. But it was my white privilege that I allowed myself to forgive and participate in that, because by my justification, if one Black student had a lead role, then it was okay. But it was very much not okay. Microaggressions are verbal and behavioral and environmental, and they're quick to miss or let them slide because they're not always intentionally racist. But the roots of these questions and comments and statements that people of color receive daily are rooted in this ideology that continues to set minorities apart from white people. And there is a psychological impact. For me, trust is broken. I cannot share my true self with someone once they've expressed an ignorant or racist belief. And if I do have the courage to address it, I get a dismissive response. You're being too sensitive. And so I'm dismissed. And so I stayed silent so that I could just get through high school. And I watched my mother survive for years as she worked in the Haddonfield School District, and her burden is far more immense than mine. And she experienced microaggressions that she would probably say she would bear again because she wanted her children to experience an exceptional education. And it's because of my mother that I'm grateful for Black parents, especially Kelsey Daniels, who will probably speak later, who fight for their children and push for their equality and are met with opposition and defense and unfair characterization that they're being abrasive or loud or non-compliant. It's because of my mother that I'm grateful for Black staff like Hamasi, who'll be sharing, and during my years, Dr. Noah Tennant, who have undoubtedly had to filter their emotions, especially as Black men, and soften the realities for the sake of maintaining their standing in their workplace, and having this to manage a double consciousness of how they're viewed by staff, parents, and students. So I didn't have language for these things back then. I was not able to articulate or even identify the grief and the struggles that I endured and witnessed. But now we are aware. And even if you don't agree, there are layers here. And I will no longer plead ignorance when the resources are here and available. It is a choice to engage. It is a choice to be open to correction and practice being slow to defense. And I've been a part of the problem, and I'm choosing my lightness and my privilege for change. Thank you.
Thank you. Now I want to go to Hamisi.
I keep hearing a doorbell in my background. It's driving me nuts. I've been trying to turn it off. But hello, everyone. My name is Hamisi Tarrant. I'm the Dean of Students. I started this year. I'm formerly a teacher in the Cherry Hill school system. I went to Cherry Hill High Schools, Cherry Hill Middle Schools, and I transitioned from Camden to Cherry Hill when I was 12. And so for a lot of our students, my experience and their experience were similar, where you're growing up in somewhat diverse community, people who look like you, and then you're moving to a place where no one looks like you. And as Maddie said, there's something with your identity that changes as you try to adjust. You know, you have your normal adolescent trying to figure out who you are, but then there's that added stress of trying to figure who you are as a person of color in these communities. And so my story kind of takes place with me really developing who I am back then. And to kind of fast forward as an adult, you know, I really try to have this open dialogue similar to what we're doing now. It was something that pained me not to have growing up. So as I was talking to a friend of mine who just happened to be white, he spoke about how overwhelming this time was for him and how he was able to remove himself by turning off his phone and shutting down social media. But for me, it wasn't like that. For me, I have to explain to my 12 and 10-year-old how racism is real and see the pain in their eyes of knowing that someone might dislike them because of the color of their skin. You know, I don't get the opportunity to shut down when it doesn't feel good. I have to keep going. I have to keep pushing forward. I have to be able to communicate. And that takes a great toll when I'm dealing with my own emotions and my own fears. And part of my dilemma is, as I talk to people in the past who not necessarily had a diverse approach, I would get the comments of, well, racism, it's not like it used to be, or it doesn't exist as much, or you need to get over it. That was a long time ago. When we talk about police officers, you often hear there's one bad cop. When you people want to compare their plight to mine, well, I grew up poor too, or I came from a single family household. But a lot of those experiences are individual, where my experiences are every day. I've been just continually share my story. I've been commonly pulled over. I've been pulled over by the police 13 times. I've dealt with women clenching their purse and locking their doors. And I've dealt with these since the age of 9. And so if you think about how a Black person grows up in a white environment, and those lasting marks, they leave something. They leave a little bit of a trauma. And for me, that trauma is something I have to deal with every day. And every time these new incidents come up, it's connected to me. It's connected to how I grew up as a child. It's connected to the experiences I had. They're not independent of themselves. So when those friends of mine or those people who had a dialogue, these experiences, they're not connected to. For each person who's shot and killed, I'm connected to each time a person is pulled over, that resonates with me. And so my dilemma is overcoming that fear every day I walk out into the world, whether it's coming to work, whether it's going to the supermarket, whether it's going for a jog. I have to overcome that fear. And so when coming to Haddonfield, that fear was alive and it was growing. And how did I come to grips with it? And a lot of that was conversations with our administration. A lot of that was conversations with my family and the community that supports me. And there was a great fear coming in this town to work. Fear from all races about the racism in Haddonfield. But my choice to come here, one, was for people to understand that the fear of going to a new place, we have to move forward. And for me, having students who had a similar upbringing than I have, being the only African American in school, it was important for me to be here for them. And so, in closing, it's really, as we move forward with this whole conversation, it can't just stop. And it has to be an ongoing dialogue that we all somewhat feel uncomfortable about, have to continue.
I want to switch to Kelsey.
Hi, my name's Kelsey. I have lived here for 13 years with my husband and my son. He's a rising junior. And I want to thank the board for putting this together and using, what's going on in the world as a catalyst to bring a light on what's going on in our community as it relates to the whole world. And I find myself here tonight, as I do every couple of years, sharing my experience as a Black person with the hope of lessening racial tension. And I've shared my experience with friends in the community, with individuals, with groups, and I've listened. And what I always find is that I'm faced with denial and defensiveness and pushback, almost as if what I'm saying is not true. And then I, in turn, get frustrated, and then I just give up until the next time something comes up, because it always does. But it seems like every time something comes up, it's a little bit bigger than the last time. And what I'm afraid of is that these issues are going to continue to get bigger and bigger and bigger, both on a micro level and a macro level, and they'll be unmanageable. And if we don't try to correct them now, and I don't think these corrections are just good for my family or other families of color, but it benefits our white counterparts, because these kids are going to leave Haddonfield, this small community, and they're going to take their learned behavior with them, and it won't be a bubble. And it might not, people might not want to have a conversation at that time. And Black people are going to keep moving here. People of color are going to keep moving here. Gay people are going to keep moving here. And it just seems more prudent to have these conversations now before they become unmanageable. And I do understand that a person's life experience shapes the way they view the world, but it just doesn't seem realistic that some of our community don't believe that there's racism here. I mean, there's racism in the whole world. Haddonfield's a part of the world. So it only makes sense that some of that would be reflected in our community. And I see it. I mean, my son gets, or he has in the past gotten, racist memes sent to him. And, hearing Madeline speak just broke my heart, because my son's biracial and he doesn't talk a lot. And, it's hard for me to believe that he doesn't experience something face to face. I mean, he says he doesn't, but I think he just doesn't want to make me sad or make me get on another town hall meeting and talk about it. But thank you for sharing that experience, Madeline. Not that long ago, I was talking to a woman who I guess was a friend of mine, who's well respected in the community. And she was telling me a story about how her and her husband saw two suspicious Black men at the 7-Eleven in town. So they followed the boys through the store. Then they got in their car and they followed them until they left town to make sure that they didn't steal or cause any harm. And when I asked her what made them suspicious, she said to me, "When was the last time I saw two Black guys buying candy together?" Which I immediately thought of Trayvon Martin. And in preparation for tonight, I was reminded of another time that white people got in their car to follow Black people to make sure that they didn't cause any harm. And that was Ahmaud Arbery in Georgia. And thankfully, that situation didn't end in anyone's death. But unfortunately, too many times, Black people get the short end of those confrontational situations. Of course, we agreed to disagree, because she said she would have done it if it was a white person. So I asked her, in her 20 years here, had she done it to a white person? And of course, the answer was no. So to deny that there's racism here is mind-boggling to me. I guess I know not everyone is on board with town halls and the subsequent work that comes with it. But what I do hope is that when I tell my story to white people, or when any person of color in our community shares their story, that white people will listen without the defensiveness, without the excuses, without the pushback, and be open for growth, and encourage their children to welcome children of other race into their life. And I hope the parents do that too, because in the end, Black people don't really want pity or handout. We really just want respect and to be valued and to be treated with dignity. And I frankly think that's a small ask. And I thank the board for putting this together, and I do look forward to what's next. So thank you.
All right, so thank you to our first panel. If you have questions, I think you can throw those into the chat box. I also have a few questions I'm going to turn to, first of all, from the ones that were submitted in advance. So anybody on the group that would like to ask a question of these participants, put that in the chat. In the meantime, I'm going to start with one, and any of the panelists who just spoke, the set that just went, could take this up. The question, and this was asked by someone via the online submission form, is, have you ever felt unsafe in Haddonfield solely based on your race? I see you nodding, Micah. You want to take that one?
I think the unsafe part of it is that, especially in Haddonfield, I feel like a lot of the students live their life knowing that they don't have any repercussions for their actions, and knowing that I can't have that same viewpoint can be really frustrating and really difficult to manage. I know just a couple weeks ago when I'm with a group of friends and it's as simple as let's play hide and seek, I'm always thinking about the worst case scenario in my head, because how bad does it look if I'm just behind a bush? Because someone can take that story and run with it and manipulate it in a way that I'm causing someone harm when I'm just trying to hang out with my friends. So I think just seeing how other students are living their lives so, I guess, dangerously per se, or just as carefree as they can because they know that they'll have a way out of any situation, I think can be really difficult. And it's just kind of like a frustrating, unfair type of feeling, because I know one mistake and it's over, it's done. So I think that's just kind of the constant feeling that I've been having throughout living in Haddonfield.
Right. Okay. And I wonder if either Maddie or Jada, do you want to take that up? And I'm thinking particularly from that psychological safety sense that y'all both alluded to, right? Safety is not just a physical safety or a safety from persecution, police presence, being in trouble, but it's a psychological safety.
Yeah, I can go. I would say physically, no. Like I said, I'm light passing. And most of the time walking around Haddonfield, I was with friends. And so physically, I never felt unsafe. My brother, it's interesting to think, when he first attended Haddonfield, he was a little, antisocial in the beginning. And his look was a trench coat and a dark black beanie. And I give thanks to God that he was attending high school in a time before mass shootings really started to take effect, because my concern is that had that been his look during a time of that, he would not be safe. But as to psychologically, I think I'll go back to kind of what I stated earlier, that it was normalized to me that I couldn't fully express myself in front of people. And so I don't think I had this sense of I feel unsafe. I just acted out of, I can't truly be me. I can't listen to certain kinds of music that's going to personify me as a Black girl. I can't do things and look a certain way. I just acted out of that. So during that time, no, I didn't have that framework to understand it was a defense, that the way that I acted and the things that I did.
Okay. And Jada, do you want to add to that or pass?
I can just briefly add to that. I do think I do relate to Madeline, and in the way that I am biracial, so I am lighter in my skin color. So I do think in the physical safety aspect, I don't really experience that, at least here, or in my experiences. I'm not saying that's the same everywhere. But I do also relate to Madeline when she said that she feels that she can't freely express her way of thinking. At least my friends, none of my friends are African American or Black. So sometimes I feel like maybe if I do say this, or if I don't say this, I will be judged in either way. And it's not even that they are not accepting people, they are. It's just that I don't know how, I kind of struggle with my way of portraying of how I feel in stuff, everyday events and everything like that. So that's all I have to add, I guess.
Okay. The next question I see is about, in the ones that were previously submitted. What would you say to someone who would like to help make lasting changes in Haddonfield, but does not know where to start? And I think we can start maybe with Hamisi, and then Kelsey, and then if one of the others wants to speak too, but let's start with those two.
Yeah, I think ultimately the start comes with your internal conversations. For me, having conversations about race are not just something that I do here. These are books I'm reading. These are conversations I'm having with family members and friends, and start having those uncomfortable conversations with your circle. Because if you could do that, then you could eventually branch out and maybe having the same uncomfortable conversations in the community and school system, things of that nature. So my advice would really be to just start the dialogue, making yourself uncomfortable and listening to other people's situations.
Okay. Kelsey?
What I've learned about myself and my family is that I used to think that because we don't do certain things or speak a certain way in my home, that my son was going to be okay. And I learned the hard way that he picked up other things in the street and he repeated them and he got himself in trouble. So I think it's not enough to not be racist. You have to actively talk to your family. You have to be very, very careful about what you say, even if you're just joking, even if you're just repeating something that somebody else heard. I mean, you have to actively denounce it and speak against it. Another thing is, even in this forum tonight, I think I shared with the panel that I need people to stand up for me. I need my allies. I've been telling this story for a very, very long time, and I haven't been believed for a very, very long time. And I'm not going to stop speaking, but now that we have this opportunity that the world around us is aware, I need my white allies to support me and to stand up and to speak for me and say, she's not crazy. This really is going on. So to be active in your home, to be active outside of your home, to be active in your social network, to speak against this and to denounce it and stand up against it.
Okay. So I'm looking over here in the chat, and I don't know, any of the Makai or Jada or Madeline want to add to this, or are we good to move to the next question? Okay. The next question I have that came in, it kind of mirrors some of the conversations that are happening in the chat, but is also one of the previously submitted questions. And I will let any of you that were on the panel decide who wants to take it first. The question says this: Wanda Sykes said, if you don't have a Black friend, you are part of the problem. How can the district help white students and white teachers form real relationships with people of color? Go ahead, Jade, I see your hand.
I think a lot, at least on a more personal level, it's having that representation of people of color in our teachers is so important. I remember I had one teacher in my entire life in 6th grade. She left the district a year or two ago for a state job, but she had the biggest impact on my life just from her being a person that I knew I could talk to and relate to. And for that to be the only person, at least for me, is like insane for me to think. Why don't we have this representation for people who are younger so that they can grow up having this experience and having this conversation with other people? Because when we're talking about ignorance, we want people to learn and learn through other people's experiences and their relationships with other people. So being able to have teachers who are people of color and who can represent that part of themselves to our children and to everybody else in the community, I think is super important.
Mm-hmm. Anybody else want to take this question on, the how can people form authentic relationships with people of color?
That is a tough question.
Thank you. That's why I passed it to the panel instead of taking it myself.
As a person of color, you want, I think overall you want relationships to be genuine. There was a very good article from from a guy outside of Boston who really talked about being a token Black guy and how that affects his ego and his self-esteem and how he's still trying to find his identity. And my relationships with people who are not of color aren't based on color. They're based on mutual interest, whether it's our family bond, our community bond, us growing up together. So that's how you get meaningful relationships. I would say be careful in seeking out relationships with people of color just based off their color. However, at the same time, I think it's okay to go out of your way to be friendly, and if it just happens to be a person of color and you have a lot in common, then so be it. But my one advice is I know it's not really towards Haddonfield, but it's to branch outside of your town. I have a friend that's in Menson there's similar racial demographics to Menson as Haddonfield, and he has to be intentional with surrounding his kids around different groups of people. And a lot of times we play sports, we do all these things within our town, but when you have a chance to do those extracurricular activities outside of your town, do it. Put them in experiences that are diverse, where they can learn about different people as much as possible.
Okay. I have a question, and maybe we can open this up so the person is Stacy Brown. Downing something? Brown Down? Could you ask your question maybe if we unmute your mic? So Gino, if you could unmute it, Stacy Brown -DOWN something.
Downham. That's what I go by Miss Brown at the high school because it's just much easier.
Okay.
The question I had, and I'll be on the next panel, is just when I heard Kelsey's question, how can we as educators signify to parents and students? Like I know I'm as the GSA, the Gender Sexuality Alliance coordinator, we have this is a safe space sign for our LGBTQ students. How can we signify meaningfully to parents and students that there are those of us who have done the work or working through that? It's always a work in process, but that we have really unpacked a lot of our white fragility and will not respond to you with defensiveness and will be your true ally. So that my question is, how would you, is there anything that we could do other than something performative, obviously, but that would be a real sign to you that we're here as allies?
Okay. I would just say to be there and to be honest with having communication with your students. I think making sure that your students feel like that you want to understand or that you do understand what they're going through and that you're there for them. Because I think that's what a lot of Black people want to feel, or like personally in my position and growing up and going into high school and having to deal with that, I think just wanting to feel grounded is a feeling that a lot of students want to have. So I think just making sure that you're willing to set up that support system and being that support system for Black students here, I think is super important.
Yeah. I think it's one of the interesting things I'll say about being an ally is that you don't actually get to name yourself an ally. Other people have to name you that, right? Yeah. And so it's through your ongoing persistence and presence and actions and the way you live and interact that people will see you and name you ally. So I think that's an important question. I'm going to do one last question for this panel.
Can I say something, Shelley, to that? Along the same lines, my son wouldn't seek out a teacher of any color. So I think a teacher and an administrator just has to make themselves visible and available. And then my son will decide, oh, this is a safe person for me. Not any special attention, but to see you more often and to speak words to him and say that I'm here if you need me. And then he will feel safer and trust that that role is being fulfilled by that ally.
Yep, creating the space. The last question I think I'm going to ask this panel is Jessica Fingerman. If we could let her mic be active, Gino, Jessica Fingerman.
Hi.
Hi.
So should I just read the question?
Sure.
Hi. So I wrote, thank you to the panel. I really appreciate it. I have a question. I've been having discussions with my circle, meaning extended family, neighbors, etc. I've seen exactly what Mr. Trump, Ms. Daniels, and everybody in the panel has been saying. You know, for example, a Black person will report to a group, this is what happened to me. And the first thing out of somebody's mouth will be, well, are you sure? You know, what was it? Did they mean it? You know, how do I know that that's true? You know, like there's this Facebook group, What's Up Cherry Hill? And this gentleman, 5 minutes away from where I live, had a sign that said Black Lives Matter. And he said people, you know, threw bottles at him and said, you know, bad things to him. And the first comment that someone made was, what evidence do you have to us that happened? I was like, it happened. He said it happened. That's his evidence. Instead of saying, you know, wow, what do we need to do as a community to make sure that doesn't happen again? Anyway, you know, other people will say in the conversations I've had, oh, racism is a thing of the past. You know, why can't they get over it? You know, slavery ended in 1865. Systemic racism doesn't exist. Institutional racism doesn't exist. You know, who are you going to call if you need the police? Like, just all of this stuff where I'm like, okay. So I when I push back with statistics, when I push back with, you know, the way that I've read some things, it's just defensiveness, and I just don't get anywhere. So I wanted to hear, is there something else I could be saying to my circle to help?
Who wants to take that one on?
You know, when trying to find solutions, it's tough. I think we're all searching for answers. We're trying to figure out what to do and how we can help. And even when we had our initial meetings, just thinking of allies, like I don't really seek out allies, but what I do seek out is people who acknowledge that race exists initially, and then really people who can have conversations about race without being defensive. And that's for me personally. So for you, I would say keep having those conversations, keep expanding your circle to the people with different views, and then keep having those conversations with them. It's not going to be easy. It's not going to be comfortable. I really think you can lose friends as well. But ultimately, your goal is to progress as a human being, and talking about race and inequality is key to that.
Right. I'm going to say, just to wrap this portion of the conversation up, there's two things that came to me as we were talking this last little bit. One is that what we're really looking for, rather than allies even, is accomplices, right? And I was part of a panel just the other day at Rowan where we were talking about the difference between an ally and an accomplice, and the idea that an ally kind of felt like a safe place to be, right? Like, yeah, I'm down with your cause. I'm good with it. Yay. Whereas an accomplice is a no, I'm right there with you, in front of you, beside you, putting myself on the line in the same way that you put yourself on the line every day. So that might be one interesting thing for you to consider, those of you who are thinking about this ally-accomplice thing. But the other thing is, Paul Gorski talks a lot about, if you're going to be actively anti-racist, one of the first things that you have to be prepared for is the loss of likability, right? If you start to use your privilege to disrupt the systems of privilege that then threaten other people's privilege, odds are some people gonna stop liking you. Absolutely. And you got to be good with that. You've got to be ready for that, right? And you've got to be committed to that. And so it is about continuing to push forward in the conversations, to not let them slide. I think one of the ultimate markers of privilege is the fact that you don't have to stay engaged. You can choose to walk away from conversations. You can choose to disengage. You can choose to go about regular life. without having to keep in the fight. And so to be actively anti-racist requires a commitment to staying in the fight, to suffering that loss of likability, to maintaining that accomplice status, even when it gets hard and frustrating. And I see it in the comment, like talking to a brick wall, all of those things, right? Because those of us who live on the other side of the privilege spectrum don't get to walk away from the conversation. It's always there, right? So that's the thing I think I'd leave y'all with in thinking about the ally accomplice and what your role can be. With that, I want to shift us to the second panel. The second panel are people who have been identified as having actively taken up that ally accomplice kind of role, who are actively working towards anti-racist practices and policies and behavior. And so I'm going to do the same thing as we did with the first panel, is give each of them a moment to introduce themselves, their role here in Haddonfield, and tell some important point about the work that they're doing, the experiences they've had. Again, you'll be able to add questions into the chat box. I've got some pre-selected questions as well. But I want to start this section of the panel with Katrina, I believe.
My name's Katrina Edwards. I'm a rising senior at the high school. I'm really involved in drama club. I'm a peer bias leader, and I'm going to be treasurer with Jada and Mackay for student council this year. But overall, I've found that through my career, I guess, at Haddonfield, is that I really love the environment, and I've always wanted to push to make it a better environment and for more of myself and my classmates to come to school and have a better place that we want to be at. So in light of recent events, I've been reflecting a lot on what I can do. And having this conversation, it just came to me that I'm not sure whether it's just a societal thing in America that we deal with, but I've noticed it a lot in the white community, that people always want to take action right away to just solve the problem and be done with it. And I think that's really problematic, because what's really going to help the issue is to take a step back and look inside ourselves. So I found, in thinking about what my role would be in this, is the first thing I kind of had to accept with myself is that I have benefited from white privilege my whole life. I come from an upper middle class family. I've lived in Haddonfield my whole life, gone through the whole school system, and I have never known a world where I did not benefit from that privilege. And I think that in our community, I'm going to echo the sentiment of a lot of what's been said, but in our community, it's really important for that recognition to happen, as there's been so much denial. We had a conversation, I was talking with Mackay and some other students about the lacrosse incident and how going to school, so many kids were saying, "Oh, are you sure the girl heard them right? Are you sure that this happened?" And it always seems to be that there's a sense of, oh, that can't happen in our town. But it's not just a problem in Philadelphia. It's not just a problem in Camden. It's happening here. And it's been brushed under the rug for so long. But something I've learned about trying to be a better ally is that it's okay to have open conversations, and that's the best thing that we can be doing, I think. I think that especially in this cancel culture we're living in, so many people are terrified of saying the wrong thing, and that's causing more people to be silent, which is really our biggest enemy right now, is so many people are not saying anything at all. And I would hope that maybe after conversations like these, more white people would see that it's okay to have open dialogues. And if you say the wrong thing, you can take a step back and look at yourself and grow as a human yourself. With Mackay, we organized the protest that happened last Wednesday. We made the group South Jersey Students for Change. And it was really important for us to make that student-based. That was our biggest goal. And so we started reaching out to teachers and different students who were involved in peer bias, who we thought would be interested in that type of activism. And then we ended up reaching out to students in Pennsauken, Woodland, Collingswood, and Haddon Heights, to name a few. And what became very important to the group was that interdistrict relationship. And Mackay and I were talking about it, and we were saying, isn't it funny that the only time we talk to those kids are on the sports field when we're already told that we're enemies and we're pitted against each other? And so we realized that it's just so important that in speaking to these other kids, like we all had the same goal. We're interested in the same things at school. We all wanted to set up this protest together. But there were definitely moments where the conversation got uncomfortable or there was friction just because of pre-existing ideas of the other towns. And there were definitely moments when I said the wrong thing or I said something that could be taken that way or that was insensitive. And other students were able to say to me like, oh, you should have said that in a different way, or that's not a good idea. We should do this instead. And it was really, really uncomfortable, but I was able to take a step back and hear what they were saying and change the way I think about certain things. And that was a really important learning moment for me, I think. And I hope to continue to grow in that way. Makai and I want to continue the inter-district relationship because we think that's so important. And just in hearing different people's experiences outside of our bubble. So that's just a little bit of what I've been trying to do. Obviously, the journey is far from over, but I thank you for inviting me to speak tonight, and I really enjoy hearing everyone.
Thanks. Now I want to go to Casey.
Hi, everybody. My name is Casey Brandenburg. I am an alumnus, I guess that's what you say for a single person, and I graduated in 2014. I have a whole thing prepared, so if I'm not looking at the camera, that's why. So here we go. Many people do not believe that racism exists within Haddonfield. They don't believe that they're racist, perpetuate microaggressions, or benefit from white privilege. If you are one of those people, you are most likely lied to during your formal education. And it's not entirely your fault, but now it's your responsibility to learn. If we all learned about Benjamin Franklin as a human trafficker who enslaved Black people, of George Washington as a president whose dentures were not made out of wood, but instead of enslaved people's teeth, I believe that this conversation and perspective would be very different. It's no accident that we learned about the LA riots, but not the Tulsa Race Massacre, about Central Park, but not the bulldozing of a mostly African-American owned neighborhood called Seneca Village to create it. That we don't know about how white settlers from Europe, our very own ancestors, stole this land from the Lenape tribe and claimed it as our own. Again, this is systemic, and it's no one individual's fault, but we must recognize the problems with Haddonfield's curriculum and notice the systemic whitewashing of history textbooks, lack of anti-racism education, and intentional lack of diversity in suburban towns, which was mostly driven by redlining. It is our responsibility to right those wrongs and prevent further damage. This is not the time to feel guilty. It is the time to help and to act. The Haddonfield School District offers crucial space for students to learn and grow. At institutions as highly ranked as the Haddonfield School District, students should be presented with facts and exposed to the whole truth of U.S. history. Students should be allowed to critically interpret and consume information, and by no means should they graduate from Haddonfield Memorial High School without being able to recognize systemic racism, oppression, and white privilege, their experiences with it, and the role they play in upholding the racist and unjust systems in which they participate. You may say, I am not a racist, but you all participate in racist systems. Just 2 years ago, the New Jersey Board of Education found that the Haddonfield School District was not in compliance of both the Amistad Commission and the New Jersey Commission on Holocaust Education. That was surprising for me to hear, especially for a district that seems to hold itself to high standards. According to their website, because I had to look it up too, the Amistad Commission's goal is to change the landscape of study for the United States and world history by placing Africans and African Americans at the center of the narrative as agents rather than as bystanders or victims who live in the margins of the United States and the world. This is like calling people slaves instead of enslaved. Like nobody is a slave. They were enslaved by other people. The Amistad Commission mandates that curricula in kindergarten through grade 12 include the teaching of the African slave trade, slavery in America, the vestiges of slavery in this country, and the contributions of African Americans to this country. The New Jersey Commission on Holocaust Education, on the other hand, mandates that curricula in kindergarten through grade 12 address issues of bias, prejudice, and bigotry, including bullying through the teaching of the Holocaust and genocide. Right now, we may learn a little bit about those things. We have one class that is offered every other year that is called Holocaust, but a lot of these problems that we have right now, I feel like those two major commissions, like we need to look at those, because this education, this isn't new, this isn't radical, this is something that should have been implemented a long time ago. The lack of education on these topics is clearly damaging. A former student wrote, "I did not learn about the systemic continual impact of slavery or our white supremacist society until I left Haddonfield, when my eyes were open to diverse people and different perspectives. Haddonfield Public Schools has a critical role to play in the development of predominantly white, affluent young people. It is imperative that the Haddonfield School District actively seeks out Black, Indigenous, people of color educators and administrators to teach Haddonfield students in all areas of education. The only Black teacher should not be a history teacher just because they can teach about slavery. They should be in the arts, they should be in English, they should be everywhere. If your immediate response to this suggestion is that there are very few or no Black or people of color applicants, you must also know that this response highlights the systemic and systematic oppression of Black people." One community member said, "Racism and discrimination cannot be ignored any further. Real actionable changes are needed. This content is both ethically and legally necessary, and the lack of this education is, as I said before, damaging to Haddonfield students." Furthermore, it seems as the majority of this cultural competency content is focused at the high school level. I would like to stress that this curriculum change needs to happen for every grade in all classes, including language arts, math, science, art, music, and social studies. This should happen in Haddonfield Middle School, Haddonfield Memorial High School, J. Fithiam Tatum Elementary School, Elizabeth Haddon, and Central Elementary Schools. We must teach every day about the real history of the United States and the integral role of Black people played in shaping every part of the country as we see it. This means reading and discussing works by Black authors in English language arts classes. It means highlighting and centering Black voices in math, science, history, and art. It means trusting Black perspectives, like those we heard earlier, and owning up to the racist, whitewashed history of the United States and specifically of the borough of Haddonfield. This means exposing all the ways white people deliberately and systematically oppress Black people through slavery, the 13th Amendment, the war on drugs, mass incarceration, and more. This means celebrating, not appropriating Black culture every day of the year, not just during the month of February, which is Black History Month. This also means recognizing our whiteness and, in turn, our white privilege. This means teaching younger students the color of your skin impacts how people move through life every day, even if they cannot see or feel their privilege. This includes teaching about Haddonfield's own racist history, from the KKK rally in 1924 to referring to parts of the town as the ghetto or Little Africa, which I experienced both in my high school experience. It is not acceptable to deliver these lessons once a month for one unit or one assembly just to check the cultural competency box. Recent op-eds, news articles, and student and alumni stories have specifically shown that business as usual allows Haddonfield students to use racial slurs and microaggressions in school, at athletic competitions, and in town without experiencing any repercussions for the violence they are perpetuating. Racism and discrimination cannot be ignored. Real, actionable changes are needed. Time is no longer an excuse. This content I am advocating for must be placed at the top of Haddonfield School District's priority list. We must take action now.
Thanks, Casey. Now I'm going to shift to Stacy. I guess Mrs. Brown.
Yeah. Ms. Brown, yeah. Okay. Yeah. Thank you so much. And thank you to our first panel. I think it's a real gift that you've given us here tonight to be so vulnerable with us. And I appreciate that immensely. So I'm Stacy Brandana. My pronouns are she and her. I've been an English and special education teacher for about 13 years in Haddonfield. Before that, I was born and raised in Ontario, Canada, and taught there. I've been an American citizen since 2013. So when I moved here, coming from a very different system of education, but I carried with me conditioning as a white person. I grew up watching the Detroit news, where people of color were disproportionately represented as criminals. I had those kind of really messed up associations because my town was largely white. I did not have a lot of exposure to people of color to build those powerful bonds and friendships. So, I first came here and I knew I lived down the street from, I knew that Haddonfield was this predominantly wealthy white town. I knew down the street there was Camden that was largely people of color and very, economically oppressed. But I just didn't think that was my problem. I thought, I'm not even American. This is something this country has acquiesced to. Like, what am I, but I was very wrong, right? So when I became an American citizen, I really shifted my perspective and shifted my ownership of that, of our shared complicity in these systems that create these inequities. So I began to do a lot of the work to kind of educate myself. I watched The 13th, Ava DuVernay's documentary called The 13th, which I think should be required viewing for all Americans. So if you're out there and you have not seen it, please watch it. I did a lot of reading, like Kamisi said, just kind of reading and talking in my own circles. And then as president of the Haddonfield Education Association, I was given the privilege of attending an Undoing Racism workshop, which is a 2-day intensive experience where we really delve into the roots of systemic injustice in America. And I expected it to be the similar makeup of the towns and the school that I worked in, very much white, us talking about racism in our own echo chambers, but I was really refreshed to walk into a room where I was a minority. And I was surrounded by a bunch of dynamic educators of color who really were there to share in their experience of what it's like to be an educator and to teach Black and white children in our local schools, and to see the lack of representation in educational leadership and educators, to see the implicit bias toward white children and white educators, to feel that lack of support for themselves as educators. I think being a teacher is very, very difficult, and to feel like on top of that, you don't know if the way you're being treated, if racism is at the center of that, or that it's at the center of that and you aren't heard. You could see what a painful experience that was. And yet the tremendous resilience of our Black educators and students to be able to walk in every day to those environments and to continue to do that work it can't be understated. So in that setting, it was very much established that white folks were there to listen, that more than speak. When it was finally my turn to speak, I admitted, I didn't always maybe speak and teach as much about racism as I wanted to, because I wondered, who am I, this white teacher from Canada, coming into America, teaching Americans about their own history? Did I have a right to do so? Did I have a right to speak about racism when I'd never experienced it? And the response I received set me on the path that I'm on today, where I'm duty bound. I'm duty bound to do that work, not to speak for people of color, but to lift their voices up, to expose students to those primary sources, writers of color, directors of color, bringing guest speakers into the building. And as Makai and I are trying to do, really bridge those gaps between our districts, because we want students to have meaningful experiences with one another. We want to be able to do this work together, because it's not going to happen unless we're not together. And I also, anybody who hasn't read White Fragility, I feel like that was a key part of my process. And I feel like that is one of the greatest obstacles to this work, is our own white fragility. So I wish I'd read that before I went to that workshop, the Undoing workshop, because as I was reading, I went, oh, I was doing that, I did that. And I want to not only not embarrass myself, but I don't want to put my Black friends and students and colleagues through that process of having to watch me go through all of those steps, right? It's not their job to help me through that. So just some of the things that Robin DiAngelo mentions in her book that are the markers of white fragility, I see them everywhere now, in myself and in others. And I think that if you can read that book and do that work within your sphere of influence, right? Get the book club together. And I think that can be the beginnings for some of you. Some of you are well beyond that, but for anybody who's looking for a point of entry, to get over the defensiveness that comes out of us when anybody makes any suggestion that we may have some sort of racist impact. We say it wasn't our intent. We deny, we dislike, we rally around the white person who's done the act of racism, and we make the person of color give us some sort of 30-page manifesto of how they know that was racism in that moment, instead of just believing and being there with them and showing up for them. So as Shelley mentioned, I think being that non-racist isn't enough. Trying to be as a white savior is not the goal. Being an ally is okay, but being that co-conspirator, really being there to wrestle with the ugliness inside of ourselves and recognize what we have to gain by doing this work together. That this is not a charity we do for other people, that it is a releasing other people from this superiority complexes and supremacy that we have built this country around. So I feel like it is like, I have to try to find that space between like driving a Mack truck through this and saying like, time to act is now. Like this is a life and death, as we've seen in the reasons for the protest, which I helped the students organize the one in Haddonfield and in Collingswood. I just feel like this is a matter of life and death, and there's not more time to coddle each other. You really have to do this work now. And that's kind of where I'm at, trying to both call in people with love, but also know that this is time to act as now. It was a long time ago, but certainly now.
I'm going to shift to Melissa.
Sorry, just unmuting. Hi, my name is Melissa Brand. I want to thank the district for inviting me to be here today. And I just also want to express my appreciation for the vulnerability of all the speakers who have come before me. Just so moved and impressed, and thank you. I feel honored, and I feel uncomfortable being identified as an ally. I'm not sure what I have done yet to deserve that distinction in being here today, but I will talk a little bit about how I found my way here. So I've been a resident of Haddonfield for 12 years now, and I have a child in the middle school. I have a history in education. I was a public school teacher before becoming a psychologist. I've worked in urban school reform. I've worked in prevention programming development, and I really care about the fight for equity in education, but also in healthcare. One of the things that was really an eye-opener for me was to discover at the time I was doing urban school reform that we were the fourth most segregated school district, in the nation, not school districts, a state with regard to segregation in the nation. So anybody who thinks that's that doesn't happen in the North, or that, we've moved past Brown versus Board of Education and we have integrated the schools and, there isn't a legacy of slavery that still exists today. That's not the case. This is how systemic racism plays out in our society today. And I was very privileged to be able to move to this town. And it was a consideration for me that coming out of Philly, I was losing the diversity of the city I loved to come to a school that I knew would have a good education for my child, but would have a loss of that diversity. Stacey, I want to say a funny little story about white fragility. I went to the library to take it out, the Haddonfield Library, and we had to get it through ILL because it did not exist in the Haddonfield Library. So, that's the kind of thing that's sort of emblematic that, why would we need that in our town? I grew up in a predominantly white neighborhood in North Jersey. I grew up with those subtle racist messages that, like driving into the city, my mother would say, lock them up. And that, communicated on some level that I was entering some kind of danger, and it takes a lot that gets inside your head. And it's really hard to talk about those things because they're humiliating and embarrassing that we have those pop-up thoughts. But I really feel like we have to begin to have these conversations and take these risks. I was deeply uncomfortable to be coming here to talk today. I was afraid I was going to be the only white community member on this board expressing myself about this. That wasn't a child or a teacher or student or a teacher, sorry, not child. I don't want to speak for anybody but myself. I really, I can't speak for anybody else's experience, but I was really moved when a letter went out from the district initially after the George Floyd murder, addressing the issue. I was glad that a letter went out, but I was really, really concerned about the language of that letter. Didn't once refer to George Floyd's death as a murder. It didn't take a firm anti-racist stance as a district. It didn't address a stance against discrimination of all kinds. It didn't express concern for families of color and how they might be affected. And it focused on the shock and fear and trauma that really our predominantly white children in the town must be experiencing at the protests and all of the sequelae of these events. And I really cringed as I read the letter, and it struck me as evidence that there is so much more work that needs to be done. And I shared it with some friends of mine, and we talked about how we felt about it. And I realized, I could just not do anything. I could just let it go. And a couple days passed, and it just occurred to me that silence is complicity. If I don't say something, then, I'm part of the problem. And so with 4 other mothers in the district, we wrote a letter citing our concerns about what had gone out, and it was immediately met with a response, and we had a discussion, and the district shared what they've done so far. And whereas I do think that the district has taken some steps in the right direction, I think that those steps remain at a superficial level. And I want to give an example of one, the letter that went out is one example of that. But secondly, the schools are reading more multicultural books now, which I think is fantastic. And my child was reading Brown Girl Dreaming in ELA this past year, which if you're not familiar with it, it's a memoir and poems that focuses on the life of Jacqueline Woodson from birth to the age of 10 during the civil rights movement. There was not one discussion held about racism related to that story in her class. And then when the final project came around, the children were given a choice of addressing racism or families or memories. And I just wonder how many kids who haven't been taught how to have a conversation about racism went towards that racism conversation. If you don't have the tools to have that conversation, you're not going to go towards it. And this is not meant to be a call out, because I don't think calling out people has any positive effect on how to get transformation. I really think that we need to be focusing more on how we have these uncomfortable conversations. I've been uncomfortable all weekend thinking about having this conversation, but and I'm sure the others who have shared probably feel a similar discomfort, but it's so necessary. Another teacher, another ELA teacher in the middle school shared a video about systemic racism with their class. That teacher happened to be a teacher of color. And I, just as Kelsey was saying, that it shouldn't sit with the people of color within our community to be the voices about what's happening. It shouldn't just rest with the teachers of color to open up these conversations about racism. That's my piece. Thank you.
Okay, so we have 2 more people on this panel, Jeff and Scott. I'm going to ask y'all to be as succinct as you can be in your remarks, so we have a minute for questions. But let's start with Jeff.
Thank you, and thanks everybody on the panel. It's been great listening to everybody, and I want to tell a little bit about myself. My name is Jeff Bogard. I've been teaching social studies at Haddonfield for 30 years, and I'm now the facilitator of the high school social studies department. And a couple of things I just want to touch on that people have already said. Stacy was saying how hard it is being a teacher, and Katrina said sometimes people are very afraid to say the wrong thing. So I think one way I can sort of sum up the changes that have been happening is in 2000, I teach AP US government and politics, and certainly never a dull moment when you're teaching a course like that. In 2009, when Barack Obama was inaugurated as president, we had a school-wide assembly in the high school. Everybody from the high school went to the auditorium to watch the inauguration of our first African-American president. And 8 years later, when Donald Trump was inaugurated as president, the message was sent, like, maybe you shouldn't show this in the classroom. And like, that's how quickly things have changed for social studies education. And, as a teacher, I'm constantly trying to think, like, how are some ways that I can stay current, that I can learn different things. I think one of the key things in this is professional development. And last summer, I had a really great opportunity. I was given a grant by the National Endowment for the Humanities, and I studied for 3 weeks in Alabama. And I went to a program, a man who was affiliated with the Southern Poverty Law Center, and kind of focusing on the concept of teaching hard history. And this is something that Casey referred to as, things like, what are some things you want to incorporate in class? So whereas 30 years ago, when I would teach, Thomas Jefferson wrote the Independence, said all men are created equal, now we're at the point in American history where we're teaching students like, yeah, well, he did that, he wrote that, but he also, we now know, enslaved his own children. So, there's just so much to process. There's so much else that's there. So I think that ongoing professional development is something that's really, really key. Things like the Amistad Commission and kind of understanding a lot of that. I think it's also important to note, and a couple of people have said that is hiring people of color. I think that as a student, I don't think I had an African-American or any non-white instructor until I was an undergrad, maybe even graduate school, actually. So I think that, and it was such, as a history student, I learned so much more from a different perspective. So that's something where I think that we have a lot of work to do. But because there's so many things that are added into this, such as Holocaust education, things with the Amistad Commission, there's always a big focus on civic education. I know that this is something that's going to be incorporated into standards. My seniors, when I get them, they always refer back to things that they learned in 8th grade. So kind of having civic education is so, so important. I know that the standards are also going to now include LGBTQ standards for curriculum as well. So it's this constant changing focus on that. And then somebody had also mentioned we have an elective course called Race, Class, and Gender, kind of making that as a required course. And this is another really plea that I have, and I really wish that we could spend more of an effort in kind of showcasing the social studies department and the humanities courses, because there are a lot of students, as our curriculum has grown so much, as there's been other, math and science and computer science classes, a lot of students are choosing to take U.S. history online. And I don't know how that started, why that started, but I kind of looked before I came on here today, for the course numbers for next year. And we have more students who are signed up to take U.S. history online for next year than we have that are signed up to take race, class, and gender. So I think that, there's a lot of opportunities to do this. I think there's a lot of ways for students to have a lot of growth. And I think we're doing a really good job, but there's obviously a lot more that we could do as a district.
Thank you. Let's go to Scott as our final panelist.
Thank you. And I'll keep this short and sweet and respectful of everyone's time. Thank you for the organizers putting this together, panelists, and everyone that came out tonight to listen to this. So I'm here as a property owner and resident in Haddonfield. I have 2 children in the school district. I moved from Philadelphia 7 years ago because the quality of the school district and education, and I'm happy to call Haddonfield my home. I got quite a rude awakening a few years back with the lacrosse incident. One was the incident itself, but secondarily, my wife was had very thinly veiled threats for speaking out against this, and it boggled my mind. I came from Philadelphia. For my whole life, I've lived in this very integrated community, and I'm like, where do I live, right? What is this town? And about a year ago, I'm coming back from the airport in Philadelphia, had a lift, which I've done maybe like 30 times. I'm in a car that had black tinted windows in the back, and the driver was a person of color and got pulled over as we were driving through off of Warwick. And I saw the shock of the police officer when she looked in the back of the car and saw that, now this was just a Lyft driver taking me home. And was like, I've lived through this my whole life, and it's like, I got to do something. There's something wrong here. And more recently, there's a group that has formed inside of Haddonfield that I feel very strongly that I need to dedicate the rest of my life to just not let people be complicit. You cannot be silent. If you're silent right now, you are on the side of the oppressors. The gist of what I want to say today is, in my opinion, understanding and empathy are keys to healing the racial divide. Our kids are not learning about the deep-rooted hatred and violence that people of color have endured for centuries. I believe teaching our kids the painful truth of this country's systemic oppression will enable them to identify and challenge the prejudices that have prevented people of color from having the same opportunities and success as their white counterparts. Our education system should evaluate if our curriculum is providing adequate focus on how people of color have been and continue to be treated in this country. And where it's found lacking, we should move quickly to address those issues and ensure our children are given the information necessary to understand the plights of those in this world who are different than themselves. In addition, being taught by more racially diverse faculty will better prepare our kids for the real world and see people of color as role models and leaders. They're not getting this right now in our education system. So I'm here to lend a hand. Any support I can give to the school district in making these changes to our children's curriculum, I'm here. And I would be happy to be called an ally for anyone that would allow me to help. And that's what I got tonight.
Awesome, thank you. So somehow it happens to be 7:29. 1 minute left. So rather than take comments or questions, I think I want to do a summary and let you know how we're going to answer all the questions that have come in. There are questions and comments and conversations in the chat box that I know our moderator is going to pull and keep. There are all of the questions that came in via the earlier form. If you have another question, go ahead and throw it in the chat right now so we can capture it when we close out. The patterns that I've seen in the comments that came in before, in the comments that are in the thread, include a lot of comments that focus on the curriculum and questions about what we can and will do to expand the curriculum to make sure that our children in Haddonfield are exposed to a wide range of viewpoints, to the hard history, to the facing history, to broader literature bases, to multiple perspectives. So we'll get to answering those specific questions. The district folks and I will work on that and get that out to you. Another large cluster was on hiring and how do we in fact diversify the faculty in such a way to be representative of the various groups of people in the United States. Again, we will respond to those questions really specifically. There was a question about police presence in schools. I think that's an important one. And also, though, about the police in general, police in Haddonfield wearing the Blue Lives flags, those kinds of questions. So again, that'll be a response that we can coordinate at the district level. Another pattern was about questions about mentoring and support for students, faculty, community members, families who are Black, who are people of color. What's the role of the district in doing that? How can we pull together and create spaces for people to support each other? There's questions about athletics and particularly what do we do to disrupt patterns in athletics. There's some comments about the multiple forms of oppression that show up, that it is about race, but it is also about other forms of oppression. And So we'll talk about those in our responses. There's a pretty good thread, especially in the comments, about how do we hold students and each other accountable for any kind of hateful or divisive or oppressive rhetoric or actions. There was an interesting series of questions and comments about the importance of understanding the history of Haddonfield, both from the perspective or the historical pieces that were about segregation and racism and anti-Black violence, but also about abolition and the history of small portions of the community that were really integral, I think, to that kind of work. And then I think the idea of taking on white privilege, how do we do that? How do we support that? What's the role of the district, the community, the town, and the people? And the final big thread was a series of questions and comments about how does this become a long-term change, not just little curricular bits or little add-ons or little one-time things, but really fundamentally changing the direction that the town, the district is oriented to. And so what I'm going to say just in summary is there aren't any easy answers to any of this. We have spent 400 years in this country screwing it up. We're not going to fix it based on one phone call, one curricular change, or one series of meetings. What I'm challenging you to do, as we end this conversation tonight, is to each individually think about your personal role in it. In my view, the only way we affect these changes is when individual people choose to take up their privilege and use it to dismantle oppressive systems, use it to become actively anti-racist. Make that long-term commitment to not stepping away from and turning away from the challenges, because it will be challenges and it will be difficult and it will make some people mad and they will be mean to you and they will cut you out and they will say all kinds of bad, like there will be drama and trauma and problems, and welcome to the America that Black and people of color live in every day. So my challenge is that there are 160 plus people in this conversation today. What are you all going to do? That's my question. Thanks.
I'd like to take a moment to Dr. Zion to thank you for monitoring this. Thank you all the panelists for your excellent work. And thank you for all 162 of you, like I said, who are here participating. As Dr. Zion said, it's not going to be one thing. And we're going to need you in 6 months. We're going to need you in a year. We're going to need you in 18 months. So I know I speak for myself and the Board of Education that we are committed to this, making this better for the long haul. And we're going to appreciate the help as you all come along with us. So with that, thank you and good night.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you all.